Hello, everyone. Welcome to another brief lecture for Phil 101, Introduction to Philosophy. This is a chapter on philosophy of religion, reasons not to believe. So we are following up our discussion from earlier about the standard arguments for God's existence. And please be sure to have a look at this chapter. This is chapter 4. And just as a brief setup, we saw the the standard arguments for God's existence, things like the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, and the ontological argument, as well as the argument from religious experience and miracles to things like proper basicality. And now we're looking at reasons that philosophers have challenged or used to challenge the existence of God. And so there's a lot going on in this chapter. So I will try to keep this brief, but we'll look at some of the main highlights here. Okay, so most of the arguments against belief in God come from these, really three of these, the first three. So attributes of God. So this is the list of attributes that people commonly associate or attribute to conceptions of the divine, specifically monotheistic religions. So a lot of people point out that there may be inconsistencies with this kind of understanding of God. The most common argument against God's existence that's discussed in the philosophical literature and from history is the infamous problem of evil. So we'll talk about that in just a second. So a natural question in philosophy of religion, and really religion in general, is if a God exists, what are they like? What's God like? The standard story that monotheistic religions in particular like to point to are these three: omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence. So omnipotence refers to God's power, right? God is able to do anything that they want. God is all powerful. Also, many people suppose that God is omniscient. God knows all. And also, God is omnibenevolent. In other words, God is all good or morally perfect. There's a lot of other characteristics that are often cited. So I have those here. So going back to Descartes, we get things like God is immaterial because God's not composed of matter. Certain gender issues with that, which are very interesting, but we'll set that aside. Also, you often hear people talk about God being omnipresent, meaning God is everywhere. You hear people say God is eternal, immutable, unchanging, infinite, things like that, certainly necessary. We saw that from Descartes. So there are lots of characteristics that are attributed to God. And especially with these three, this one in particular with the problem of evil is going to be an issue for critics of theistic belief, as well as this one, omniscience, because typically most theists want to maintain that God is omniscient, but that humans have free will. But as I'm sure you might have seen in the chapter, and maybe even before you read the chapter, certainly I thought about this in Sunday school when I was younger. If God knows what's going to happen, how are my choices free, right? Because if somebody knows the future, can we really say, or how do we make sense of the fact that somebody would know what's going to happen and have that choice be free on my part, right? So this is the problem of divine foreknowledge, that if God knows all, then how can we make sense of free will, right? So lots of issues here. I'm just kind of summing them up, but certainly with these three characteristics, many philosophers have challenged these attributes of God. Okay, so again, one of the common attributes associated with God is that God is all perfect, right? Same thing with omnipotence, right? So if God is all powerful, is God able to do anything at all, right? That's has been a big philosophical question. Descartes famously answers that yes, God is able to do anything at all, even violating logical truths. So you might have seen in the reading and the media things, the other media, things like, can God create a stone so heavy that they couldn't lift it? Well, I mean, that depends on who you ask. If you ask Descartes, God is able to violate logical truths because God wrote the logical truths. So that's one answer. Other people answer no. It is the ability to do whatever is not the same thing as the logically impossible, right? So different people answer this question in different ways. In either case, it refers to God's maximal power, right? What God is able to do. Perhaps this is dictated by God's notion of maximal perfection. That's one way to frame it. But nonetheless, these are attributes that we attribute to God's omnipotence, right? Whether God's power should be conceived in maximal terms or what's logically possible. So again, whether or not how you answer this question is going to depend on what attributes you want to attribute to God. Obviously, there's disagreement on whether God is omnipotent, and these logical puzzles are meant to challenge whether God can do the logically and physically impossible. So what's the problem, right? I mean, as I mentioned before, can God create a stone so heavy that God cannot lift it? Can God create a square circle, right? Things like that. How about these? Can God, an all good being, can God sin? Can God do evil? Right? That's a question. If God is meant to be omnibenevolent, how do we explain so much evil in the world? This leads to the problem of evil. And so this also gets into the problem of divine foreknowledge. Can God control beings which they willed to be free? So if free will comes from God, or is ultimately of God's responsibility, as many philosophers have supposed, how do we square that with the fact that God knows what we're going to do? It seems like that violates our intuitive notion of what it means to be free. So if we're thinking of another case, if a friend of mine knows exactly what I'm going to do, when I'm going to do it, what I'm thinking, all of those things, then it seems to diminish the notion of free will, critics are going to charge, right? Because how is that free? It seems like I'm just like a puppet on puppet strings at that point, right? So this is, again, the problem of divine foreknowledge. So here's the general pattern of what we might call the paradox of omnipotence. Going back to the question of power. God either can or cannot create a stone that is so heavy that they cannot lift it. So either they can lift it or they can't, right? If God can, then they are not omnipotent. If God cannot, then they are not omnipotent. Therefore, God is not omnipotent. And if God exists, then they are omnipotent. Therefore, God does not exist. So there's a couple different ways that the theist can get out of this. One way is to just give up on omnipotence and say, well, we don't know, because of paradoxes like these, whether God truly is omnipotent in our understanding of it, so we should just dispense with omnipotence. There are ways of addressing this that we won't be able to spend really any time on, but this is certainly meant to present one challenge to the so-called divine attributes, right? This paradox of omnipotence. So here's a couple of responses. Harry Frankfurt says God can do impossible. He can do two impossible things in this case. He can create the stone, and then two, he can lift it. So there's one. I mean, you could just bite the bullet and say, yeah, there is no impossible. There's a couple other philosophers, both of whom we've seen before, Plantinga and Richard Swinburne. They say something like, God has the ability to revoke their own omnipotence and only does so when they actualize the paradox. So this is a pretty creative solution. This is to say, God is omnipotent, but God could remove their own omnipotence when they encounter a paradox, right? So in other words, they can remove their own limitations after they encounter something that they can't deal with under the normal laws, right? I think that's a very clever response from Plantinga and Swinburne. So that's one possible response. There's another one from Keene. God's ability to create such a stone, despite their inability to lift it, affirms their omnipotence. So maybe we could just say God has the ability to create such a stone, but that just proves that God's omnipotence. So that may be convincing to some, but not all. Classical theists, though, that we encounter in the Middle Ages, they typically say, look, God's omnipotence is limited by logical possibility, but it need not mean all powerful, right? So we just need to reform our notion of all powerful, but God is bound to the same laws of logic that we are. So Aquinas and others are thought of as affirming that even God can't do the logically impossible, because that's just not consistent. So that's one response. So you can see here, there's a couple of different responses to this paradox, and I'll leave it to you to come down however you think is best. Omniscience. So to go back to this, God is often thought of as, this is a funny cartoon on the right here, all-knowing, right? So remember our epistemology section, we said all-knowing, right? If we're talking about the JTB account, justified true belief. Well, what are the problems with that? Well, predominantly free will. How are we able to do otherwise if God knows all, right? So it's good to remind ourselves of what we mean by knowledge, at least in the philosophical sense. Okay, so I've kind of already mentioned a few of these things. So the problem, right, it goes something like this, right? If God gave humans free will, how can everything be part of God's plan, right? Because if God has a plan and wants, especially in the monotheistic tradition, wants us to affirm either some religious tenet, but he knows how we're going to act, then doesn't that seem kind of bizarre? A lot of philosophers are going to say, like, what's the point of being surprised at a pair of dominoes if you know that one of them is going to fall, right? That doesn't seem like the domino is going to have any sense of free will, and humans are in a similar position, right? How do we make sense of the fact that God not only knows what's going to happen, but has determined to some degree what is going to happen? So obviously some compatibilists, so remember that's the view that determinism is true, but there's some room for free will. If you're a libertarian about free will, then maybe there's a way to make sense of this, because God's foreknowledge does not infringe upon one's ability to do otherwise. This would be Augustine, St. Augustine, as well as Alvin Plantinga. They try to say that there's really no meaningful way to make sense of determinism. So Augustine compares human knowledge with God's knowledge. So one way around this problem is to say, if one's foreknowledge of a future decision does not refute one's free will in one case, then it does not refute it in another case. There's a lot more to be said for that, but a lot of people don't find that response very motivating. Some people do. Alvin Plantinga tends to frame this in defense of theism as potentiality versus actuality, that in some cases we're talking about the potential to do something versus actually doing something, and there might be a way to make sense of divine foreknowledge there. Other people, though, are incompatibilists about it. Even those who might be theists, you might say, look, human knowledge and God's knowledge just cannot be compared. So Nelson Pike argues famously, look, either give up free will or God's omniscience. You cannot have both, right? They're incompatible with each other. So I'd be curious to know what you think. I mean, do you think there's a meaningful way to make sense of divine foreknowledge and free will? If yes, then, right, you're going to have to give an argument one way or the other. Or, as some philosophers have chosen to do, just bite the bullet and say, give up free will or God's omniscience. Can't have both at the same time. Okay, let's get to the more famous argument against theism in the problem of evil. So the problem of evil, very famous problem. If you're anything like me, it's something that you've thought about for a long time. There seems to be a lot of evil in the world, right? And there's a couple different ways of framing this. If we look at quite a few other religions other than just the Western Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, a lot of religions, especially indigenous religions and even other ancient religions, this isn't as much of a problem for them. So I think that's good that we have a note about this, because if you look at other belief systems, evil was acknowledged and even made part of the belief system in ways that Christianity and even Islam and Judaism haven't quite done to the same degree. So you might think that, like Zoroastrianism, God is both a force of evil as well as good. So evil is not really a problem that needs to be reconciled. But certainly for the monotheistic traditions that most of us are already familiar with, it is a problem for philosophers and for theists to have to deal with. So we're taking that problem at face value. So the philosophical problem is really this, right? Again, people associate specifically omnibenevolence with God, that God is all good. But then we look at the world and we see there's a lot of suffering, a lot of evil. And not just that, a lot of evil that could be prevented, a lot of needless suffering, a lot of needless evil that could very easily be prevented, right? So whether it's people dying from COVID-19 or from fires, plane crashes, or famine, right? I mean, take your pick. There's a lot of evil in the world. A lot of senseless death, senseless violence that doesn't really seem to be part of any kind of plan. So how does the theist account for this, right? Because the problem is, if such a being existed, then they wouldn't allow evil, but yet evil clearly occurs. So we've got some hard choices to make here. So we've got a logical problem that might lead to God doesn't exist. So this is what many philosophers have argued. This follows deductively from the inherent contradiction between God and evil's existence. They cannot both be true. So one, you've got to give up one, the existence of evil. So just deny that there is evil, which seems like a tough sell, or give up one of God's attributes. Okay, so lots of philosophers like J.L. Mackie have made this argument that, look, they're just not simpatico. God's omnibenevolence with the sheer amount of unnecessary evil in the world, they're just not compatible. So that's a logical problem. The other way to frame it is what we might call the evidential problem. To say something like, it's not that it's logically impossible, it's just very unlikely that God exists given the amount of unnecessary suffering and evil in the world, right? It's not a deductive inference, rather it's an inductive one, and it's from the amount of unnecessary evil in the world. Because it seems unlikely, according to this way of framing it, that such a being would allow so much evil, right? So one must either give up the existence of one of God's attributes or explain why such a God would allow so much evil. And so there's a couple different ways of framing this. William Rowe famously does this in his problem of evil argument, or his argument against theistic belief. Okay, so there's a couple of common rejoinders at this point. Some people, like I mentioned, they actually just deny that evil exists. They just say that it's something else, right? That evil is just a construct of the mind. I mean, that's one way, but regardless of how we frame it, we want to take the most straightforward and basic notion of evil. And I think most of us would agree that there is still, whether we call it evil or suffering, there's a lot of that going on. And there's a lot of that going on in even worse in certain parts of the world, right? Where children are dying from preventable diseases, or right, lack of clean drinking water, things like that. So however we want to frame it, it should be clear that there's a wide variety of what normally we would call evil that needs to be accounted for, right? Okay. Now, at various points, theists respond by saying, well, look, there's different kinds of evil, so maybe we should be more careful. There's general evil, right, which can be thought of as that which causes human or animal suffering, right, whether it's a disease or something else. And then maybe the moral ones, right, like the bad things that which individual humans are responsible, right, like murder and robbery and things like that. So then there's natural evil, right, like terrible events that occur in nature of their own accord, like volcano eruptions. Some philosophers view natural evil as moral evil that the devil is responsible for. So this is one way Alvin Plantinga gets out of this problem, by saying that natural disasters are caused by the devil. That's not a very popular position, I must say, but it is a position that, you know, a very famous, smart philosopher has taken. So maybe you find that attractive. I'm not here to pass judgment on that, but I wouldn't say that that's a very common view, to just say that all volcano eruptions are the devil's fault, or all hurricanes are, right, or tsunamis are caused by the devil. I mean, you can, but I'm not sure that's a very compelling case to make. So what theists do is they try to give what's called a theodicy. This is an attempt to defend God's existence by providing some sort of justification for why such a God would allow evil, and to the extent that they do. In other words, theodicies will argue that there is no contradiction in an all-good, all-powerful, and all-knowing God allowing evil to occur, and that God has or had a good reason for its allowance. So this is the point at which theists come in and say, let's not get carried away. There's a way that we can salvage a notion of something like omnibenevolence with the existence of so much evil. So usually theodicies come in a couple different varieties. One way to do it is to take the free will defense, which is to argue that God's primary aim was to grant us free will. And in fact, it would be contradictory for God to then intervene, even to prevent evil. This is, I think, the most common response, right? That yes, God did grant us free will, and yes, there's a lot of evil, but God can't interfere even to prevent evil, because that goes against God's primary mission with his creation, right? And then you would fill in those details depending on your religious persuasion. So that's one way, what we would call the free will defense. Another common rejoinder is, or theodicy, is what's called the soul-making defense. And this is quite common. You hear a lot of people say this, that in order to be good, we need so much evil, right? In order to value things like love and friendship and charity and things like that, there has to be bad things that happen, or else we wouldn't appreciate the good things, right? In a simplified version. So in other words, this is the argument that says, in order for our souls to be worthy of eternal paradise rather than damnation, they need to overcome evil, and or good cannot exist without evil. That's a very common theodicy. Another way to argue for, or another way to give a theodicy in this sense, is to give the best of all possible worlds case. And this is essentially to argue that in the end, all evils are actually just leading to some greater good, and or that this is the best of all possible worlds God could have created. So we might complain about the world that we inhabit, but this is the best possible world we could have hoped for that God created, right? So notice that there's a similar strand, a familiar strand going through all three of these defenses, but they're all types of, but distinct theodicies that try to reconcile the amount of evil with standard notions of God's attributes. Okay. Obviously, the strength of each theodicy or defense will depend on its ability to account for why a God that is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent would allow both moral evil and natural evil, right? That's something that the theist is going to have to account for. Because, right, Now, interestingly, I should point out here, a lot of people are going to say that natural disasters are now no longer a natural evil, but a moral evil, especially since climate change, humans have accelerated, right? Um, you know, the the probabilities of big storms and the increased global temperatures, right? That it's really humans. But obviously, there are things like volcanoes that really aren't dependent at all on climate change, at least as far as I know, that would still occur even with or without humans, right? But there is an interesting case to be made that climate change is a moral evil, right? If you're framing it in terms of the theist versus atheist framing. Okay, there's a couple of objections to these kinds of theodicies. One response is to say, well, I mean, yeah, that might explain moral evil to some degree, but not natural evil. So unless you maintain that all natural evils are also the result of sin, in which case there are additional concerns. So some theists think that natural evils are in response to human moral evils. I mean, that's a strange defense, right? It seems weird to say that a volcano erupted because of the original sin, right? I mean, some people might find that compelling. Many people don't. It seems like a lot of innocent people have been, killed because of natural disasters that didn't seem culpable, right? So this goes back to the original sin discussion. So that's one criticism of the free will theodicy. Yeah, and even so, many feel free will is not enough to justify certain groups suffering unnecessarily. For example, children, right? As I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of children that are suffering right now. And it's not like they're doing anything wrong, right? They just happen to be born on the wrong, in the wrong zip code. And so it seems like there's a whole lot of moral unluck in this case. And so it seems weird to blame, a child dying of starvation in certain parts of the world on, right, Adam and Eve, the criticism goes. So they have a little ability to exercise their own will in defense of that. So that's another thing to bring up here. The soul-making defense, right? Remember, we can't appreciate the good without evil, that kind of defense. A response to that is, that just still doesn't account for why there's so much evil, right? It seems like a lot less would be enough to warrant reward or achieve a good design. So in other words, I mean, do we need, millions of children dying of dehydration to appreciate the good? Like, why can't it just be a little bit less? It seems like we would accomplish the goal of understanding and appreciating life with a lot fewer children dying, right? So it seems like there's an inordinate amount of evil for God to achieve that plan, right? Yeah, and it also doesn't seem to account for the disparity in suffering between different groups of socioeconomic injustice and others, right? It seems like there are parts of the globe that are suffering because of socioeconomic political reasons, not because they're any more evil or nefarious than other parts of the world. So it doesn't seem to match up with that. Another criticism that goes against the soul-making defense is, I think, related to this point, if I remember how I framed it. If it goes something like this: if evil helps us appreciate the good, well, that opens up to a really bad problem, I think. That means that you should want evil to occur, right? Because if evil leads to good, then you would want to bring about evil things happening. And that seems absurd, right? Because if we appreciate life by seeing so much death, then it's almost like you would want to promote evil so that people learn lessons. And that seems really untenable, right? So that's another problem with this soul-making defense. is that it seems like it's valuing evil above and beyond the value that we get from good things occurring, right? So that's another criticism of the soul-making theodicy. But anyway, let me leave it there. Hopefully you really enjoy thinking about philosophy of religion and some of the problems that philosophers have thought about. And thanks as always for listening.